Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this very topical conference. It's been truly interesting to listen to the previous presentations. Lots of thoughts for reflections. What I would like to do right now is to share with you some reflections that I titled a structured approach to AI-based health research, seldom asked questions. Maybe I should rather say a contextual approach to AI-based health research, because I would like to make a kind of a holistic presentation of the kind of legal issues that one as a legal researcher, a legal practitioner comes across. When I say seldom asked question, that is not a conclusion based on a statistical investigation, public inquiry, but rather experiences from having worked within the field of law and IT for quite some time. And I'll of course come to the kind of questions I'd like to pinpoint. I would right from the beginning say that there is no expression of some kind of a relevance listing, but rather points that I find relevant. This session is oriented towards data security and AI in the health care environment. I will take the liberty of understanding that data security in a broad sense has implications with regard to legal safety, the rule of law, and also the role of law. And I will apply a legal professional perspective to some points. And well, why seldom asked questions? Well, that's really up to the audience to reflect upon in terms, maybe the questions are too simple. That will be good then from a legal safety point of view. Maybe some of the questions are rather a bit delicate, or may they even be boring. In terms of seldom asked questions, I will have a focus of projects. We are all, I take it, more or less engaged in different kinds of projects, and there are loads of initiatives in the public sector, in the private sector, in the cross-border sectors. But the mindset in this brief presentation is a project in its generic character. And one thing that strikes me is that, I mean, AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. How do we, within a project, how do we conceive of AI as a method, as a technology, as a what question mark? And from a legal point of view, working quite a lot within the legal domain, one experience is that lawyers, judges, for instance, don't really relate AI to the modern kind of technology, ICT, that people that are doing professional work within the field would do, but rather, shall I say, misinterpret the AI-based orientation towards research and development as any kind of automation. I mean, there is so much hype creating AI, so much hype associated with AI that, in spite of the challenge or possibly no possibility to actually define AI, a first reflection is that it might be more important than one might think to try to achieve some common understanding of AI in relation to traditional information communication technologies. So some kind of reflections of AI is, I would argue, important, and not least from the point of view of the non-tech people that need to understand that AI not necessarily that there are different kinds of, for instance, automatic decision making. A second point I would say is we quite often talk about research and development, and as if it was clear cut what is meant by research on the one hand and development on the other. And sometimes it's wise to try to distinguish between the different kinds of tasks, activities, not least from a legal point of view, as for instance, in Sweden, there are certain legal frameworks applicable to research, of course, not only in Sweden, but broadly speaking, but also with regard to ethical vetting, ethical analysis. And it might be different activities within our European Union project, for instance, within the health data area. Could very well have a mix of development activities and truly more research oriented. So that's one distinction to keep track of. And I'm not saying that is easy, but sometimes we talk about research and development as if it was more clear cut than it actually is from a legal point of view. Yes, and a third point I'd like to make is the fact that although there's lots of funding into the area of AI's potential, both from the point of view of means for decision making and the means for decision making, and also the kind of types of data that can be processed. But what about the legacy data, the heritage, the digital heritage in terms of old kinds of algorithms and conventional applications that are quite far away from AI? And it's not as if those kind of applications are the most attractive ones. But if we are going to move forward in terms of research and developments, someone needs to care about legacy, both legacy data and legacy applications, bridging the back to what we actually have to a very large extent as a fundamental infrastructures in our digital society as of today. Information security. Well, what is the impact of information security? Of course, I dare say, it's absolutely crucial to comply with information security in the context of AI, and of course, so in many ways. And here we need to bridge the gap between conventional law, conventional legal assessments, and, if I may say so, not being a security, not being a techie, but anyway, having to work with information security. I find quite often that there are different cultures, academic cultures, commercial cultures, and what we need to do is to bridge the gap between information security, broadening into cybersecurity, and other kinds of that direction. And what one can't see then is the fact that the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is very modern, if I say so, or open to information security by way of including such security aspects as confidentiality, integrity, availability, accountability, explicitly included in GDPR. But also we have questions concerning other information security, the way in which there are requests for both technical and organizational measures, and also the way in which the GDPR allows for very challenging, but anyway, a kind of a toolbox of anonymization, pseudonymization, de-identification, encryptions. I mean, there is a whole new security perspective included in the GDPR, which opens up, I would argue, for a kind of strategic approach to GDPR. And how can you talk about strategic approaches to a legal framework? Well, I think, I mean, legal compliance is one thing, but there are quite a lot of potential when it comes to personal data protection for research purposes, including AI-based or approaches. However, as previous speakers have illuminated in a very interesting way, there are fundamental challenges, not least with regard to rights of access, explainability, etc., and the black box problem. To add on the list of important factors, the seldom asked questions, and on the top of this slide, here is one example. Well, what about the morale among the researchers? And not least from a legal point of view, do we always apply trustworthy, reliable solutions when processing sensitive health data, for instance? How do we honestly deal with requests for information about ongoing processing of sensitive health data? How do we really comply with security requirements? How do we, from a security point of view, use different kinds of platforms for collaboration? And there are several on the market. So I would argue that ethical issues is not only getting a permission from from a particular public authority, but also how do we deal with sensitive health data in a broad sense at our home office, which definitely could be in the digital environment. Furthermore, reflecting a bit about the lawyer's role in this kind of application environment, and I think it's worthwhile reflecting a bit about the kind of legal skills that are required and expected in different AI-based health data in a broad sense initiatives. There are quite often, well, mostly there are different advisory groups, internal, external, focusing on legal and ethical issues, ethical and legal, legal and ethical. But what kind of legal skills do we really need in those kind of advisory groups, but also as active partners in these not least European Union projects? One kind of legal work is very much oriented towards substantive IT law issues, how to interpret and apply legal rules in digital settings. But there are also most probably, or very relevant and interesting is furthermore the legal track in terms of legal system management. How do you assess, how do you adjust your system design, including AI-based approaches? How do you, what kind of legal skills do you know more precisely? And it boils down, I would argue, that, well, if the question is posed in terms of must a lawyer know about machine learning, depending on the application area, I would say that some kind of understanding is quite often, possibly more than one would think, for lawyers working in the area of law and IT to actually understand a bit more about also the kind of algorithms associated with different AI-based approaches. Conventionally, we have, when it comes to legal automation using traditional IT, we have applied primarily static algorithms, deterministic algorithms, as opposed to the more dynamic ones applied in the context of machine learning, of course. And from the point of view of the rule of law, there are very different implications in terms of foreseeability. That might be too much in the conventional ICT environment, but too little of when it comes to machine learning and self-adjusting algorithms. And I'm not arguing that lawyers included in different kinds of AI-based approaches should start learning how to code, but to understand the transformation, the way in which data sets can be controlled, different kinds of how you model, and the implications of black box issues, that on the one hand, black box issues challenge transparency, but if it is black box that we are dealing with using, then that might also be privacy enhancing, because the individual data subjects are not monitored in the same way. And then something that was very much topical a couple of decades ago. It was interesting listening to Heidi in the previous session and the work in Oslo. I say we have a sister institute in Stockholm, also working with, at the time, knowledge-based systems, expert system at the time, the midst of the 1980s. And at that time, there was a huge distinction. I was conditions for designing at that time AI-based solutions, the old school AI-based solutions, and so because in the Anglo-Saxon world, the decided court cases were the major base for AI-based or knowledge-based systems. Well, in comparison with the civil law system that we, to a great extent, apply here in Europe. But that kind of very strict different conditions for system design, I would argue, is not that visible. And I think it anymore. I think there is a merger, theoretically, model-wise, when it comes to the common law system, simply put, and the civil law system oriented towards rules and regulations. But this is, well, given that you can accept this as in a very broad sense, different characteristics as a basis for the legal approach to AI-based systems, there is also, I put it on the slide in terms of a risk, but I think there is a need of awareness that if you get together a group of legal professionals, the approaches to how to transform legal sources into code for a computer to execute later on, it's still the approaches might very well differ, whether you've placed an emphasis on court cases or rules and regulations. However, that is not as distinct as it used to be. But still, we do have different. Lawyers are not easily to define, and we have all different approaches to also what is research, what is not research, what seems to be, what is acceptable, what is not. So sometimes I would argue that it is important to also reflect upon the legal profession and how it can play a relevant role. And my final conclusion is that there is no doubt that the interplay between law and IT will be continued, and that it's still worth emphasizing that letting law play a proactive role in addition to the conventional reactive one, when as a kind of conflict solving mechanism, is still valid indeed. I think I'll stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. So many insightful questions brought up, thought-provoking questions.